What if freedom could be woven one thread at a time? What if the very hands that were forced to create beauty for their oppressors could also craft the keys to liberation? In the cotton fields of Mississippi, 1847, one woman discovered that sometimes the most powerful rebellions begin not with fire and fury, but with needle and thread, patience and purpose. If you're drawn to untold stories of courage that defy history's silence, subscribe to our channel now and turn on notifications. These are the voices that were meant to be forgotten, but we refuse to let them fade into darkness. The morning mist clung to the Mississippi Delta like a shroud, wrapping around the towering oak trees that lined the long dirt road leading to Magnolia Grove Plantation. It was October 15, 1847, and the air carried the weight of another harvest season. Cotton bolls heavy on their stems, ready for the picking that would line the pockets of men who had never felt the sting of thorns against their fingertips. Amara stood at the edge of the cotton field, her bare feet planted firmly in the red clay soil that had absorbed the sweat and tears of countless souls before her. At 26, she possessed a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her very core. Her skin, the color of rich mahogany, bore the scars of 26 years of bondage, yet her dark eyes held something that her captors had never been able to extinguish, an unbreakable spirit. Her fingers, long and graceful despite the calluses that marked them, traced the edge of a cotton boll. To an observer, she might have appeared to be just another field hand, indistinguishable from the dozens of other enslaved people who would soon emerge from their cramped quarters to begin another day of backbreaking labor. But Amara possessed a gift that set her apart, an extraordinary ability with needle and thread that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. The plantation stretched across 1,500 acres of prime Mississippi Delta, land owned by Nathaniel Whitmore, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his greed. The main house, a grand antebellum mansion with white columns that gleamed in the morning sun, stood as a monument to wealth built on human suffering. Behind it, the slave quarters consisted of 20 wooden cabins arranged in 2 neat rows, each housing multiple families in cramped, airless spaces. Amara lived in cabin 14 with her younger sister Zara, who was 19 and worked in the main house as a kitchen servant. The sisters had been separated from their mother when Amara was 16, sold to different plantations when their previous owner died. Through a stroke of what some might call luck, but Amara knew was divine intervention, they had been reunited 2 years ago when Master Whitmore purchased Zara at a slave auction in Natchez. Their mother, Kesey, had been a master seamstress on a plantation in South Carolina, known throughout the region for her intricate quilts and delicate embroidery. Before their separation, she had taught Amara everything she knew about the art of sewing, not just the practical skills of mending and creating, but the deeper knowledge that had been passed down through their African ancestors. The understanding that thread could carry more than just fabric together. It could carry stories, messages, and even hope itself. Every stitch tells a story, Kesey had whispered to her daughter during their last night together. Remember that, child. When they take everything else from you, they can't take what's in your hands and heart. Amara had carried those words with her through 10 years of separation, 10 years of wondering if her mother was still alive, still sewing stories into fabric somewhere in the vast expanse of the American South. The skills her mother had taught her had saved her from the harshest fieldwork on previous plantations, and now at Magnolia Grove, they had earned her a position that was both a blessing and a burden. Master Whitmore's wife, Eleanor, was a woman obsessed with fashion and status. She demanded the finest dresses for herself and their 3 daughters, Mary, age 18, Catherine, 16, and young Elizabeth, just 12. The family's reputation in Mississippi society depended partly on their appearance at social gatherings, church services, and the endless round of visits that defined plantation social life. 2 years ago, when Eleanor Whitmore discovered Amara's exceptional skill with a needle, she had pulled her from the fields and installed her in a small room adjacent to the main house. This room, barely 8 feet square with a single window that faced west, became Amara's world. Here, surrounded by bolts of silk and cotton fabric, spools of thread in every imaginable color, and the tools of her trade, she created garments. That would be admired and envied throughout the county. The irony was not lost on her. Her hands, which belonged to another human being according to the law, created beauty for women who saw her as nothing more than property. Yet in the quiet hours of her work, when the house was still and her fingers moved with practiced precision, Amara found a kind of peace. Each dress she created was a small act of rebellion, an assertion of her humanity and skill in a world that sought to deny both. But Amara's true masterpiece remained hidden, folded carefully and stored in a hollow space she had carved out beneath the floorboards of her room. It was a quilt, begun 3 years ago and worked on only during the darkest hours of night, when even the owls fell silent. This quilt was different from anything she had ever created. Each square told a piece of her story, her childhood in South Carolina, the day she was sold, her reunion with Zara and her dreams of freedom. More importantly, the quilt contained a map, not drawn with ink on paper, but sewn into the very fabric with threads of different colors and textures. It was a map that showed the route north, the safe houses, the river crossings, and the landmarks that would guide an escaped slave toward freedom. Amara had painstakingly gathered this information over months of careful listening and observation. Kitchen servants heard conversations between Master Whitmore and his guests. Field hands, who had been hired out to other plantations, brought back stories of the Underground Railroad. Even the white overseers, in their drunken moments, sometimes let slip information about patrols and checkpoints. Amara absorbed it all, filing away each detail in her remarkable memory before translating it into the coded language of her quilt. The pattern she used was called the North Star, but her version contained additional symbols that only she could read. A particular shade of blue thread indicated a safe house. Yellow stitching marked dangerous areas to avoid. The intricate border pattern actually contained directions, with each repeated motif representing a landmark or distance marker. As the morning sun climbed higher, Amara could hear the sounds of the plantation awakening. The overseer's bell would ring soon, calling the field hands to another day of labor under the brutal Mississippi sun. But for now, in these precious moments before the day's demands consumed her, she allowed herself to dream. She thought of her mother, hoping that wherever Casey was, she had found some measure of peace. She thought of the Underground Railroad, that network of brave souls who risked everything to help others find freedom. And she thought of the North, that almost mythical place where a person could own themselves, could sell their labor for wages, could learn to read and write without fear of punishment. The door to her sewing room opened, and Zara slipped inside. Her sister moved with the quick, nervous energy of someone who had learned to be constantly alert for danger. At 19, Zara was smaller and more delicate than Amara, with the same mahogany skin, but eyes that held more fear and less of the steely determination that characterized her older sister. "Morning, sister," Zara whispered, glancing nervously toward the main house. "Miss Eleanor's already asking about the blue dress for Catherine. Says she needs it finished by tomorrow for the harvest celebration." Amara nodded, her fingers already reaching for the partially completed garment that hung on a wooden form in the corner. The dress was a beautiful creation of sky blue silk, with intricate white embroidery along the bodice and sleeves. It represented hours of painstaking work, each stitch perfect, each detail calculated to showcase both the wearer's beauty and the seamstress's skill. "It'll be ready," Amara replied quietly. Her voice carried a calm confidence that had a soothing effect on her younger sister. "How are things in the kitchen? Sarah still giving you trouble?" Sarah was the head cook, a woman in her 50s who had been at Magnolia Grove longer than anyone else. She ruled the kitchen with an iron fist and had little patience for what she saw as Zara's gentle nature. The dynamics among the enslaved people were complex, sometimes solidarity born of shared suffering, sometimes competition bred by the system that pitted them against each other for scraps of privilege or mercy. Zara's face darkened. "She says, I'm too slow with the breakfast preparations, threatened to tell Master Whitmore that I'm not earning my keep." Her voice trembled slightly. Both sisters knew what happened to enslaved people who were deemed unprofitable. They were sold, often to plantations deeper in the South where conditions were even harsher. Amara set down her work and pulled her sister into a gentle embrace. At moments like these, She felt the full weight of her responsibility as the older sister. She had promised their mother that she would look after Zara no matter what. It was a promise that had shaped every decision she had made since their reunion. "Don't worry about Sarah," Amara said softly. "You're doing fine. Just keep your head down and stay out of her way when you can." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "Zara, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been working on." Her sister pulled back, studying Amara's face with concern. "What is it?" Amara glanced toward the window, checking to make sure no one was within earshot. The plantation was fully awake now. She could hear the field hands gathering for their morning assignments, the sound of horses being saddled at the stable, the clatter of breakfast preparations from the kitchen. "I'm going to leave this place," she said quietly, but firmly. "And when I do, you're coming with me." Zara's eyes widened in shock and fear. "Amara, no, you can't be thinking about running. You know what they do to runaways. You've seen the scars on Jacob's back. Jacob was a field hand who had attempted to escape 3 years ago. He had been caught within 2 days, brought back and whipped so severely that he nearly died. The scars that crisscrossed his back served as a constant reminder to everyone on the plantation of the price of attempting freedom. "I've been planning this for a long time," Amara continued, her voice steady despite her sister's obvious distress. "I'm not talking about just running blind into the woods. I have a plan, a real plan, and I have help." She knelt down and pried up the loose floorboard, revealing the hidden space beneath. From it, she carefully lifted the quilt, unfolding it partially to show Zara the intricate pattern of stitches that formed her map to freedom. Zara stared at the quilt in amazement. "How long have you been working on this?" 3 years, Amara replied, "every night, little by little. It's all here, Zara. The route north, the safe houses, the river crossings. Everything we need to know." Her sister traced one of the blue threads with her finger, her face a mixture of awe and terror. "But Amara, even with a map, it's so dangerous, and what if we get caught? What if we spend the rest of our lives as someone else's property?" Amara interrupted gently but firmly. "What if we never see Mama again? What if you have children someday, and they grow up the same way we did?" The question hung in the air between them. Both sisters knew the reality of their situation. Enslaved women had no control over their own bodies, no rights to their children, no hope of building a future for themselves or their families. Children born into slavery remained enslaved, continuing the cycle of bondage that had trapped generations of their people. Zara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the quilt. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "When?" "Soon," Amara replied. "But not yet. I need to finish gathering information, and I need to make contact with someone who can help us once we're off the plantation." What she didn't tell her sister was that she had already made that contact. 3 weeks ago, while delivering a finished dress to the Whitmore's neighbors, the Ashfords, she had encountered a free black man named Thomas Freeman. Thomas worked as a carpenter and handyman throughout the county, and his status as a free man allowed him to travel relatively freely between plantations. During their brief conversation, Thomas had recognized something in Amara's eyes, the same spark of determination that he had seen in other enslaved people who were ready to risk everything for freedom. Without saying anything directly, he had managed to convey that he was part of the network that helped people escape to the north. The next week, when Thomas returned to the Ashford plantation to repair a fence, he had left a small piece of carved wood near the well where Amara drew water for her sewing room. The carving appeared to be nothing more than a decorative trinket, but to those who knew how to read its symbols, it contained a message. "When the next new moon comes, be ready." The new moon was still 2 weeks away, but Amara felt a growing urgency. Master Whitmore had been receiving letters from his brother in Georgia, and she had overheard Eleanor discussing the possibility of selling some of their excess slaves to help finance the expansion of their cotton operation. The conversation had not mentioned specific names, but Amara knew that as skilled as she was, her value as property made her a prime candidate for sale if the family needed cash. The thought of being separated from Zara again, of being sold to an unknown master in an unknown place, was unbearable. Whatever risks lay ahead on the journey north, They could not be worse than the certainty of continued bondage and potential separation. Over the following days, as Amara continued her work on Catherine Whitmore's blue dress, she also continued her preparations for escape. She began setting aside small amounts of food, dried corn, preserved meat, anything that would travel well and provide sustenance during their journey. She also started paying closer attention to the patrol schedules, noting when the overseers made their rounds and when the roads were most likely to be empty. The most challenging aspect of her preparations was maintaining the appearance of normalcy. She had to continue producing her beautiful needlework, had to smile and curtsy when Eleanor Whitmore complimented her skill, had to pretend that her mind was focused on nothing more than creating the perfect pleat or the most delicate embroidery. It was during this time that she began to notice changes in the household that filled her with both hope and apprehension. Master Whitmore seemed more agitated than usual, spending long hours in his study with his account books. Eleanor was increasingly demanding, insisting on elaborate alterations to dresses that had previously satisfied her. Even the daughters seemed affected by some underlying tension in the family. The source of this tension became clear when Amara overheard a heated conversation between Master and Mrs. Whitmore late one evening. She had been working late on a particularly intricate, beading pattern when their voices, raised in argument, carried through the thin walls. "The debts are mounting, Eleanor." Nathaniel Whitmore's voice was sharp with frustration. "The cotton prices this season have been lower than projected, and we still owe money on the land purchase from last year. Surely there must be another way," Eleanor replied, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We cannot appear reduced in circumstances. What would people think?" "What people think matters less than keeping this plantation afloat," her husband shot back. "We need to liquidate some assets, and quickly. The slaves represent our most readily convertible wealth." Amara's blood ran cold as she listened to them discuss the potential sale of human beings as casually as they might discuss selling livestock or farm equipment. She heard them debate the relative values of different individuals, who was most productive, who would bring the highest price, who could be spared without significantly impacting the plantation's operations. Her name was not mentioned specifically, but she knew that her skills made her particularly valuable. A skilled seamstress could command a high price at auction, especially in a city like New Orleans, where wealthy families were always in need of talented domestic workers. The conversation confirmed what she had already suspected. Time was running out. The new moon was still 10 days away, but she could not afford to wait if there was a risk of being sold before then. She would have to find a way to contact Thomas Freeman and accelerate their escape plan. The next morning, as she worked on the final details of Catherine's dress, Amara formulated a plan. The Ashford plantation was 3 miles away, too far to walk during the brief periods when she might be able to leave her sewing room unnoticed. But there was another possibility. Every Saturday, Zara and several other house servants were allowed to walk to the nearby creek to do the family's laundry. The creek was only half a mile from the Ashford property, and Thomas Freeman had mentioned that he often worked near the water source, helping to maintain the various irrigation systems that the neighboring plantations shared. If she could get a message to Zara to pass along to Thomas, she might be able to arrange an earlier departure. It would be risky. Any deviation from normal routines could arouse suspicion, but the alternative was to potentially wait until it was too late. That evening, when Zara came to her sewing room for their usual brief visit, Amara carefully explained her plan. Her sister listened with growing alarm, but she also seemed to understand the urgency of their situation. "What if I can't find him?" Zara asked. "What if he's not there? Or what if someone sees me talking to him?" "Then we wait for the new moon as originally planned," Amara replied. "But Zara, if there's any chance at all, that we might be sold before then, we have to try." She gave her sister a small piece of fabric with a simple pattern embroidered on it. To anyone else, it would appear to be nothing more than a sample of needlework. But Thomas would recognize the symbols she had stitched into the design, symbols that meant urgent and ready now in the coded language used by those who facilitated escapes. Saturday came with a bright, clear sky that seemed to mock the anxiety, churning in both sisters' hearts. Amara watched from her window as Zara joined the other servants carrying baskets of soiled linens toward the creek. Her sister moved with studied casualness, but Amara could see the tension in her shoulders, the slightly too quick pace of her steps. The hours that followed were among the longest of Amara's life. She tried to focus on her work. She was now adding the final touches to a new dress for Mary Whitmore, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, watching for any sign of her sister's return. When the laundry party finally came back into view, Amara's heart sank. Zara walked at the rear of the group, her head down, her posture defeated. It was clear that something had gone wrong. That evening, when Zara slipped into the sewing room, her face told the story before she spoke a word. "I couldn't find him," she whispered, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I looked everywhere." I could without drawing attention. Some of the other women were asking why I kept wandering away from the group. I had to come back. Amara pulled her sister close, offering what comfort she could, while her own heart hammered with disappointment and fear. They were back to the original plan: wait for the new moon, hope that they would not be sold before then, and trust that Thomas Freeman would be ready to help them when the time came. But as the days passed, the signs of the Whitmores' financial distress became more obvious. Meals in the main house became simpler. Eleanor stopped ordering new fabric for dresses. Most ominously, Master Whitmore began receiving visits from men who Amara recognized as slave traders, men whose business was the buying and selling of human beings. 1 week before the new moon, her worst fears were confirmed. She was in her sewing room, working by lamplight on a repair job for one of Eleanor's older gowns, when she heard footsteps on the porch outside her window. Through the thin curtain, she could see Master Whitmore standing with 2 men she had never seen before. "The seamstress is particularly skilled," Whitmore was saying. "Trained by her mother, who was renowned throughout South Carolina. She can handle everything from simple mending to the most elaborate formal wear." One of the strangers, a thin man with cold eyes and a calculating expression, nodded approvingly. "Skilled domestics are always in demand in New Orleans. What are you asking for her?" Amara's hands stilled on her work as she heard Master Whitmore quote a price that represented her entire life, reduced to a monetary value. The negotiation that followed was brief. These men were clearly serious buyers, not casual browsers. "We'll need to see her work, of course," the second stranger said, "and we'll want to examine her physical condition." "When can we arrange the inspection?" "Tomorrow morning," Whitmore replied. "I'll have her bring some samples of her needlework to the main house." As the footsteps retreated, Amara sat in stunned silence. Tomorrow. They were planning to sell her. Tomorrow. There was no time to wait for the new moon. No time to coordinate with Thomas Freeman. No time for careful planning. Tonight would have to be the night. When Zara came for her evening visit, Amara was already packing. She had laid out their darkest clothes, the small bundle of food she had managed to save, and the precious quilt that would guide their journey north. "We're leaving tonight," she said simply. Zara's face went white. "Tonight? But—" "They're selling." "Be tomorrow," Amara interrupted. "I heard them talking. There's no more time." Her sister stared at her for a moment, then nodded with a determination that Amara had rarely seen from her. "What do we need to do?" They spent the next hour going over the plan in detail. They would wait until the plantation was quiet, usually around midnight, when even the overseers had retired for the night. They would leave through Amara's window, which faced away from the slave quarters and toward the woods that bordered the property. From there they would follow the creek north for the first few miles, using the water to mask their scent in case dogs were used to track them. The quilt would guide them after that, showing them the route to the first safe house, which was located in a small town about 20 miles north of the plantation. If they traveled only at night and hid during the day, they might be able to reach it in 3 or 4 nights. As midnight approached, both sisters knelt together in the small sewing room and prayed. They prayed for courage, for guidance, for protection on the dangerous journey ahead. They prayed that they would see their mother again, that they would find freedom, that their sacrifice would not be in vain. Then, as the clock in the main house chimed 12 times, they prepared to step into the unknown. Amara carefully folded the quilt and secured it in a waterproof oilcloth that she had taken from the sewing supplies. She wrapped their meager provisions in another cloth and tied it securely around her waist. Zara wore the darkest dress she owned and had tied her hair back with a strip of black fabric to minimize any chance of being spotted in the darkness. The window of the sewing room was small, but both sisters were slender enough to fit through it. Amara went first, lowering herself carefully to the ground and then helping Zara climb down. They paused for a moment, listening intently for any sound that might indicate they had been noticed. The plantation was quiet, except for the normal night sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the soft hoot of an owl from the old oak tree near the main house. Taking this as a good sign, they began to make their way carefully toward the tree line. Every step felt like it might be their last as free, or at least escaping people. Every shadow could hide an overseer. Every sound could be the beginning of an alarm that would bring the whole plantation down on them. But as they reached the edge of the woods without being discovered, Amara felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. The creek was about a quarter-mile into the woods, and they found it by following the gentle slope of the land and the sound of running water. The night was clear, with enough starlight to make navigation possible once their eyes adjusted to the darkness. As they began to follow the creek northward, Amara thought about all the generations of enslaved people who had dreamed of this moment, the first step toward freedom. Some had made it. Many had not. Some had been caught and returned to face unimaginable punishment. Others had simply disappeared into the wilderness, their fate unknown. But all of them had shared the same desperate hope that she felt now, the belief that somewhere ahead lay a place where they could belong to themselves, where their children could grow up free, where the color of their skin would not determine the limits of their lives. The first night of travel passed without incident. They followed the creek for about 8 miles, stopping frequently to rest and to check their direction against the stars. As dawn approached, they found a thick grove of trees about 100 yards from the water and settled in to wait for nightfall. The day passed slowly. They slept fitfully, taking turns keeping watch for any sign of pursuit. Around midday, they heard the distant sound of dogs barking, and both sisters froze in terror. But the sounds faded without coming closer, and they eventually realized it was probably just the normal activity of some farm or plantation they were passing near. As evening approached, Amara carefully unfolded the quilt and studied the route ahead. According to her coded map, they needed to leave the creek soon and head more directly north toward the town where the first safe house was located. This would be more dangerous, traveling overland rather than following the water, but it was necessary to reach their destination. The second night of travel was more challenging. Without the creek to guide them, they had to rely more heavily on the stars and on Amara's interpretation of the quilt's coded directions. They also had to cross several roads, each crossing a moment of extreme vulnerability, when they might be spotted by travelers or patrols. But their luck held, and by dawn they had covered another 10 miles. More importantly, they had reached a landmark that Amara recognized from her quilt, a distinctive rock formation that marked the halfway point to the first safe house. The third day brought new challenges. They were now far enough from the plantation that their absence would certainly have been discovered. Master Whitmore would have sent out search parties, probably including professional slave catchers with their trained dogs. The sisters would have to be even more careful now, as the pursuit would be organized and determined. They also faced the reality that their food supplies were running low. They had been careful to ration their provisions, but 3 days of travel had depleted most of what they had been able to carry. If they didn't reach the safe house soon, they would have to risk foraging or trying to find help from sympathetic strangers. That evening, as they prepared to resume their journey, they encountered their first real crisis. As they approached a main road that they needed to cross, they saw torches in the distance, a patrol moving slowly along the road and clearly searching for something or someone. Amara and Zara crouched in the underbrush, barely breathing as the patrol passed within 50 yards of their hiding place. They could hear the men talking, and the words chilled them to the bone. "The reward's gone up to $500 for both of them. one voice said. "Whitmore's really eager to get his property back." 500, another voice replied with obvious interest. "That's serious money. They must be valuable slaves." The older one's a seamstress, apparently very skilled. The younger one works in the house. Both of them together represent a significant investment. The patrol moved on, but the sisters remained hidden for another hour, afraid to move. When they finally crossed the road, they did so with the knowledge that they were being actively hunted by men who had a strong financial incentive to capture them. The fourth night brought them within sight of their destination, a small town whose church steeple was visible in the distance. According to the quilt, the safe house was located on the outskirts of the town, in a modest cabin owned by a freed slave named Isaiah Washington. Finding the cabin proved more difficult than expected. The coded directions on the quilt were necessarily vague, and the sisters spent hours searching the area around the town before finally spotting the distinctive blue door that marked their destination. Amara approached the cabin with her heart pounding. Everything they had risked, everything they had endured over the past 4 days, came down to this moment. If Isaiah Washington was not the ally she hoped he would be, if this was a trap, if they had been betrayed, she knocked on the door using the pattern that Thomas Freeman had taught her: 3 short knocks, a pause, 2 more knocks, another pause, then 1 final knock. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened slightly, and a weathered black face peered out at them. "We're looking for the North Star," Amara said quietly, using the code phrase that identified them as escaped slaves seeking help. Isaiah Washington, a man in his 60s with graying hair and kind eyes, studied them for a moment. Then he opened the door wider and gestured for them to come inside. "Welcome to freedom's first stop," he said softly. "You're safe here, children. You're safe." As the door closed behind them, shutting out the dangerous night and the pursuing hunters, Amara felt something she had not experienced since childhood, the sensation of being truly safe, even if only temporarily. But their journey was far from over. Isaiah Washington explained that while they had successfully reached the first safe house, they were still deep in slave territory. The next leg of their journey would take them through several more states before they reached the truly free territory. "Of the North, how many more stops?" Zara asked, exhaustion clear in her voice. Isaiah consulted a hand-drawn map that was far more detailed than Amara's quilt. "Here, if all goes well, maybe 8 or 10 more safe houses before you reach Ohio. Then you'll have some choices to make. Canada, where you'll be completely safe, or one of the northern cities where you can try to build a new life. 8 or 10 more stops, weeks or possibly months of dangerous travel." The magnitude of what they were attempting began to sink in fully for the first time since they had climbed out of the sewing room window, but they had already come this far. They had already proven to themselves that escape was possible, and, most importantly, they were together. Over the next 3 days, as they rested and prepared for the next stage of their journey, Amara had time to reflect on what they had already accomplished. They had broken the chains of bondage that had held their family for generations. They had risked everything for the chance at freedom, and so far, they had succeeded. More than that, they had discovered strengths within themselves that they had never known existed. Zara, who had always seemed fragile and dependent, had shown remarkable courage and determination during their escape. And Amara herself had learned that her careful planning and her mother's teachings had prepared her for this challenge in ways she had never fully understood. The quilt that had guided them this far was more than just a map. It was a testament to the power of knowledge, preparation, and hope. Every stitch her mother had taught her, every story she had heard about the Underground Railroad, every small act of resistance she had witnessed over the years had contributed to their success. But perhaps the most important discovery was the realization that freedom was not just a destination, it was a state of mind. Even during the most dangerous moments of their journey, even when they were hungry and cold and terrified, they had been more free than they had ever been as slaves. They were making their own choices, taking control of their own destiny, writing their own story. Isaiah Washington helped them prepare for the next stage of their journey by providing additional supplies, updated information about the route ahead, and most importantly, new identities. He gave them papers identifying them as free women, traveling to visit relatives in the north. Crude forgeries, but good enough to pass casual inspection if they were careful. He also put them in contact with the next conductor on the Underground Railroad, a white Quaker named Samuel Morris who operated a mill about 30 miles north. Morris would hide them in his wagon beneath sacks of grain and transport them to the next safe house, cutting several days off their travel time and reducing their exposure to the patrols that were still searching for them. On their last night, at Isaiah's cabin, the sisters sat together looking at the quilt that had brought them this far. Amara carefully studied the remaining route, memorizing the symbols and landmarks that would guide them through the challenges ahead. "Do you think Mama would be proud of us?" Zara asked quietly. Amara looked at her sister, seeing not the frightened young woman who had worked in the Whitmore kitchen, but a person who had discovered her own courage and strength. "I think she's been with us every step of the way," she replied. "I think every stitch she taught me, every story she told us about our ancestors, every moment she showed us how to be strong. It's all been leading to this." The next morning, they climbed into Samuel Morris's wagon and pulled a canvas tarp over themselves. As the wagon began to move, carrying them further north toward freedom, Amara held the quilt close to her chest and thought about the threads that connected her to her past and her future. The threads of knowledge passed down from mother to daughter. The threads of courage that had sustained enslaved people through centuries of oppression. The threads of hope that had inspired them to keep fighting for freedom even when the odds seemed impossible. And now, the threads of her own story being woven into the great tapestry of resistance and liberation that would someday, she prayed, set all of her people free. The wagon wheels turned steadily northward, carrying two sisters toward a future they had never dared to imagine. Guided by the wisdom of their ancestors and the unbreakable bonds of love and determination that had seen them through the darkness into the light. Their journey on the Underground Railroad would continue for many more weeks, through many more safe houses and friendly conductors, through dangers and challenges they could not yet imagine. But they had already achieved something that no one could ever take away from them. They had claimed their freedom. They had written their own story. They had proven that sometimes the most powerful rebellions begin not with violence or grand gestures, but with patience, planning, and the quiet courage to take the first step into the unknown. And in the years to come, when they had built new lives in the north, they would never forget the lessons of that journey. Amara would continue to sew, but now her needlework would tell different stories, stories of freedom and hope rather than bondage and sorrow. She would teach other escaped slaves the skills they needed to support themselves in their new lives, and she would always keep the quilt that had guided them to freedom, a reminder of the power of preparation, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of family. The threads of freedom once woven could never be untangled. Samuel Morris's mill appeared through the morning mist like something from a dream. The large wooden building sat beside a rushing stream, its water wheel turning steadily in the current. To any casual observer, it was simply another business in the rolling hills of Tennessee, processing grain for the local farmers and contributing to the regional economy. But Amara and Zara knew better. As Samuel Morris helped them down from his wagon, they could see the signs that marked this place as more than it appeared. The barn had an unusually large root cellar. The mill itself had hidden compartments built into its walls. Most telling of all, the Quaker miller moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "You'll be safe here for tonight," Morris assured them as he led them to a concealed room beneath the mill floor. "Tomorrow, weather permitting, you'll continue north with another friend of mine. She's got a way of making the journey seem like nothing more than a social visit." The hidden room was surprisingly comfortable, with clean bedding, adequate food, and even a few books, a luxury that both sisters had been denied their entire lives. For the first time since leaving the plantation, they could truly relax, knowing that armed men were not searching for them in the immediate vicinity. That evening, by the light of a carefully shielded candle, Amara taught Zara to read using one of the books Morris had provided. It was a simple primer, But to two women who had been forbidden to learn letters their entire lives, each word they decoded felt like a small victory against the system that had tried to keep them ignorant. "Why did they forbid us to read?" Zara asked as she struggled through a simple sentence about a cat and a hat. Amara considered the question carefully. "Because they knew that knowledge is power," she replied. "An enslaved person who can read, can forge travel passes, can communicate with other slaves, can learn about the world beyond the plantation. Reading makes us dangerous to them." As if to prove her point, she showed her sister how she had taught herself to read by studying the shipping labels on the fabric bolts that came to the plantation, by memorizing the letters on the Whitmore family Bible when she was called to mend books, by carefully observing the correspondence that sometimes passed through her sewing room. "Every skill we learn," Amara explained, "every piece of knowledge we gain makes us more free, even before we physically escape." The next morning brought their introduction to Rebecca Phillips, the friend Samuel Morris had mentioned. She was a white woman in her 40s, dressed in the plain clothing typical of Quaker families, but with an unmistakable steel in her gray eyes that spoke of someone accustomed to facing danger. "You'll be my nieces from Kentucky," she explained, as she helped them into her covered wagon. "Traveling to Pennsylvania to help with my elderly mother. If anyone asks detailed questions, let me do the talking. Your accents will give you away if you speak too much." This leg of their journey was the most nerve-wracking yet, because it required them to hide in plain sight. Instead of traveling at night through wilderness areas, they were moving during daylight hours on main roads, passing through towns and interacting with other travelers. The first checkpoint came sooner than expected. They had been traveling for only 2 hours when they encountered a group of men questioning travelers on the road. Amara's heart nearly stopped when she recognized one of them as a slave catcher she had seen at Magnolia Grove. "Morning, ma'am," the man called to Rebecca Phillips. "We're looking for 2 runaway slaves from Mississippi. Sisters. One's a seamstress, the other worked in the house. You seen anybody like that?" Rebecca pulled her wagon to a stop with calm composure. "I haven't seen any unaccompanied colored folk," she replied truthfully. "Just my nieces here and me, traveling to tend to family business." The slave catcher's eyes swept over Amara and Zara, who sat in the back of the wagon with their heads properly covered and their eyes downcast in the manner expected of respectable Quaker women. What he saw were 2 modestly dressed women accompanying their aunt on a family journey, nothing suspicious or noteworthy. "Papers?" he asked, almost as an afterthought. Rebecca handed over the forged documents that identified the sisters as free women born in Kentucky. The slave catcher glanced at them briefly, but did not examine them closely. In his experience, runaway slaves traveled alone and tried to avoid main roads. A Quaker woman traveling with proper documentation and well-dressed companions was not worth his time. "Safe travels," he said, waving them through. As their wagon rolled away from the checkpoint, Amara felt a mixture of relief and amazement. The system that oppressed her people was so confident in its own power that it could not imagine enslaved people moving freely in daylight, protected by the courage and convictions of white allies who risked their own safety to help strangers. Find freedom. Over the following days, as they traveled through Tennessee and into Kentucky, the sisters learned valuable lessons about the Underground Railroad that went beyond the simple route memorized in Amara's quilt. They discovered that the network of people helping enslaved people escape was far more extensive and sophisticated than they had imagined. There were white conductors like Rebecca Phillips, who used their racial privilege to transport escapees through dangerous territory. There were free black allies like Isaiah Washington, who provided safe houses and supplies. There were sympathetic merchants who accidentally left their warehouses unlocked when escapees needed shelter. There were church congregations that took up collections to fund the Underground Railroad's operations. Most importantly, there were the escapees themselves, men and women who had successfully made the journey north and then returned south to help others follow the same path. These individuals, who had already claimed their own freedom, risked everything to guide others toward the same goal. At a safe house in Kentucky, Amara and Zara met one such person. Her name was Hannah, and she had escaped from a plantation in Alabama 3 years earlier. Since then, she had made 7 trips back south, personally guiding more than 30 people to freedom. "Why do you keep coming back?" Zara asked. "You're free now. You could build a life in the north without ever risking capture again." Hannah, a woman about Amara's age with scars on her hands that told their own story, smiled sadly. "I can't be truly free while my people are still in chains," she replied. "Every person I help escape weakens the system that held us all. Every family I reunite in the north is a small victory against those who tried to break us." Her words resonated deeply with Amara, who had been thinking about what she would do once she reached the north. She had skills that could support her and Zara. Seamstresses were needed everywhere, and her exceptional abilities would allow her to earn a good living. But Hannah's example suggested another possibility. What if, once she was safely established in the north, she too returned to help others? What if she used her knowledge of the route, her connections to the Underground Railroad network, and her skills in planning and preparation to guide other enslaved people toward freedom? The idea was both terrifying and inspiring. It would mean voluntarily returning to the danger she was now trying to escape, but it would also mean using her freedom to help others claim their own. As they continued north through Kentucky and into Ohio, the sisters began to see signs that they were approaching truly free territory. The attitudes of the white people they encountered were noticeably different. While racism and discrimination certainly existed in the North, it was not backed by the legal framework of slavery that defined the South. More importantly, they began to encounter communities of free black people who had built lives and businesses for themselves. In Cincinnati, they saw black-owned shops, black children attending school, black families who owned their own homes and controlled their own destinies. "Is this what freedom looks like?" Zara asked as they walked through a neighborhood where black and white families lived as neighbors rather than as masters and slaves. "This is what it can look like," Amara replied. "But freedom is also what we've been doing for the past 3 weeks. Freedom is making our own choices, controlling our own destiny, deciding for ourselves what kind of life we want to build." Their final stop before reaching completely free territory was at the home of Levi Coffin, a Quaker businessman in Cincinnati who was known throughout the Underground Railroad network as the president of the organization. His house had sheltered more than 3,000 escaped slaves over the years, earning it the nickname Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. Coffin, a soft-spoken man with an iron will and an unshakable commitment to human freedom, welcomed the sisters with the same quiet dignity he had shown to thousands of others who had passed through his doors. "You've come a long way," he said. Simply, "How do you feel about the journey ahead?" It was a complex question. Physically, they had traveled hundreds of miles from Mississippi to Ohio. Emotionally and psychologically, they had traveled from bondage to freedom, from powerlessness to self-determination, from despair to hope. But the journey ahead was in many ways just beginning. They would need to establish new identities, find work, build a life in a society that, while not enslaving them, would still present challenges and discrimination. They would need to decide whether to continue north to Canada, where they would be completely safe from slave catchers, or to remain in the United States, where they might still face the risk of being kidnapped and returned to slavery. Most importantly, they would need to decide what to do with their freedom, how to use the precious gift they had claimed for themselves, and what obligations they might have to those still in bondage. On their last night at the Coffin House, Amara sat up late studying her quilt by candlelight. The coded map that had guided them north was now behind them. Every landmark passed, every safe house reached, every dangerous crossing successfully navigated. But as she examined the intricate stitchwork her mother had taught her to create, she began to see new possibilities in the patterns. What if the same skills that had allowed her to encode a map to freedom could be used to encode other information? What if quilts could carry messages between safe houses or instructions for future escapees or even financial information for the Underground Railroad's operations? The next morning, she shared these ideas with Levi Coffin, who listened with growing interest and excitement. "You're talking about creating a communication network," he said, "a way to pass information safely through hostile territory without arousing suspicion. It's brilliant, and it's exactly the kind of innovation we need to make our work more effective. He introduced her to several other escaped slaves who had settled in Cincinnati and were now working to help others follow the same path. Among them was David, a former blacksmith who had become expert at forging travel documents, and Sarah, a former house servant who had developed an extensive network of contacts throughout the South. Together, they began to develop plans for what would become known as the quilt code, a system of using traditional quilting patterns to encode and transmit information throughout the Underground Railroad network. Different patterns would indicate different types of messages: safe houses, dangerous areas, the best times to travel, even the identities of trusted conductors and hostile slave catchers. Amara would spend the next year traveling throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, teaching the quilt code to conductors and safe house operators, while also establishing her own seamstress business to support herself and Zara. Her exceptional skills quickly earned her a reputation among the free black community and sympathetic white families, providing her with both financial independence and a perfect cover for her Underground Railroad activities. Zara, meanwhile, discovered her own calling in the movement. Her experience as a house servant had given her valuable insights into the psychology and routines of slaveholding families. She became expert at infiltrating plantation households, sometimes as a temporary worker, sometimes as a visitor to enslaved family members, and identifying potential escapees who were ready to make the journey north. 2 years after their own escape, the sisters made their first joint return trip to the South. Their mission was to guide a family of 7, parents, 4 children, and an elderly grandmother, from a plantation in Mississippi to freedom in Ohio. It was a dangerous and emotionally charged journey. Traveling with small children meant moving more slowly and requiring more frequent stops. The grandmother's age and frailty added another layer of complexity, and the larger group size increased the risk of detection at every stage of the journey. But it also represented something more significant than a single rescue mission. For Amara and Zara, guiding this family to freedom was a way of honoring their own journey and ensuring that their sacrifice had meaning beyond their personal liberation. The children in the family reminded them of themselves at younger ages: bright, curious, hungry for knowledge and opportunity, but trapped by a system that saw them only as property. The parents reminded them of their own mother, whose love and teaching had made their escape possible. And the grandmother represented all the generations of their people who had endured slavery without ever seeing freedom, but whose strength and resilience had made it possible for the next generation to break free. Over the following years, Amara and Zara would guide more than 200 people to freedom through their work with the Underground Railroad. They developed new techniques for concealing escapees, new routes that avoided the most dangerous areas, and new methods of communication that allowed them to coordinate their activities with other conductors across the network. But perhaps their most important contribution was the inspiration they provided to others. Their story, 2 sisters who had used intelligence, preparation, and courage to claim their freedom, became legendary within the enslaved communities of the South. Parents told their children about the seamstress who had sewn a map to freedom. Young people facing the impossible choice between continued bondage and the risks of escape drew strength from knowing that others had made the journey successfully. The quilt code that Amara developed became an integral part of Underground Railroad operations throughout the 1850s. Quilts hanging on clotheslines or displayed in windows became a form of silent communication that allowed enslaved people and their allies to share crucial information without arousing the suspicion of those who sought to maintain the system of bondage. When the Civil War began in 1861, both sisters volunteered their services to the Union cause. Amara worked as a seamstress and spy, using her skills to create uniforms for black soldiers, while also gathering intelligence about Confederate troop movements during her continued travels in the South. Zara served as a nurse and guide, helping wounded soldiers and newly freed slaves navigate the chaos of wartime. The war years were difficult and dangerous, but they also brought the promise of an end to slavery throughout the United States. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Amara and Zara celebrated not just the legal freedom of their people, but the vindication of everything they had risked and sacrificed during their years with the Underground Railroad. After the war ended and slavery was officially abolished, the sisters faced new choices about how to use their skills and experience. The Underground Railroad was no longer needed in the same way, but the challenges facing formerly enslaved people were immense. Millions of people were suddenly free, but lacked education, resources, or connections to help them build new lives. Amara established a school in Cincinnati, where she taught literacy, numeracy, and practical skills to former slaves. She also continued her seamstress work, but now she employed other women and taught them the trade that had been crucial to her own survival and success. Zara became involved in political organizing, working to ensure that the legal freedom gained through the war would be accompanied by real opportunities for advancement and equality. She traveled throughout the South during Reconstruction, helping to establish schools and businesses in black communities. Both sisters married and had children, passing on to the next generation not just their skills and knowledge, but also their understanding of the importance of freedom and the responsibility to help others achieve it. In their later years, as they watched their children and grandchildren grow up free, Amara and Zara often reflected on the night they had climbed out of the sewing room window at Magnolia Grove Plantation. Everything that had followed, their journey north, their work with the Underground Railroad, their contributions to the Civil War effort, their roles in Reconstruction, had grown from that single moment of decision. They had proven that freedom was not something that could be given or taken away by others. Freedom was something that had to be claimed, fought for, and defended. It required courage, intelligence, preparation, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. Most importantly, they had learned that individual freedom was meaningless without collective liberation. Their own escape had been just the beginning of a lifelong commitment to ensuring that all of their people could experience the dignity and opportunity that came with controlling their own destinies. The quilt that had guided them to freedom remained with Amara throughout her life. She would sometimes take it out and show it to her grandchildren, explaining how each stitch represented a choice, each pattern a possibility, each color a hope for the future. This quilt saved our lives, she would tell them, but more than that, it taught us that knowledge and preparation can overcome even the most impossible obstacles. Your grandmother Casey gave me the skills to create it, but we had to have the courage to follow where it led. In 1895, 50 years after their escape, the sisters returned to Mississippi for the first time since their flight to freedom. Magnolia Grove Plantation had long since been abandoned, its fields overgrown, its buildings falling into ruin. The system that had once seemed so permanent and powerful had crumbled, brought down by the combined forces of war, economics, and the relentless resistance of people like themselves who had refused to accept bondage as their fate. Standing in the ruins of the slave quarters where they had once lived, Amara and Zara felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was sadness for all the lives that had been wasted by slavery, all the potential that had been suppressed, all the families that had been broken apart. But there was also pride in what they had accomplished, both individually and as part of the larger movement that had ultimately brought slavery to an end. They had survived. They had succeeded. They had made a difference. As they prepared to leave Mississippi and return to their homes and families in the north, Amara placed a small quilt square on the ground where their old cabin had stood. It was made from scraps of fabric saved from her years as a seamstress, stitched together in a pattern that had become her signature, a star surrounded by interlocking circles that represented the connections between all people struggling for freedom. "For Mama," she said quietly, "and for all the others who didn't make it this far." The wind picked up the small piece of fabric and carried it away, but the message it represented would endure. The threads of freedom, once woven into the fabric of history, could never be completely unraveled. The sisters had lived to see slavery abolished, to see their people gain citizenship and political rights, to see the first generation of children born free in America. They had contributed to that transformation, not just through their own escape, but through their years of work helping others claim their freedom and build new lives. As they boarded the train that would take them back to Cincinnati, Amara reflected on the journey that had begun with a needle and thread in a small sewing room and had led to a lifetime of service to the cause of human freedom. Every stitch had mattered. Every choice had consequences. Every act of courage, no matter how small, had contributed to the larger tapestry of liberation that had transformed not just their own lives, but the entire nation. The train whistle blew, and they began the journey back to the future they had helped create, a future where freedom was not just a dream stitched into a quilt, but a reality woven into the very fabric of American life. In the decades that followed their deaths, Amara and Zara's story became part of the oral tradition of the Underground Railroad, passed down through families and communities as an example of what was possible when people refused to accept injustice as permanent. Historians would later discover Amara's quilts in the attic of her Cincinnati home, recognizing them as remarkable artifacts of the Underground Railroad era. The quilt code she had developed would be studied by scholars seeking to understand the sophisticated communication methods used by enslaved people and their allies. But perhaps the most important legacy of their story was the lesson it taught about the power of individual action to create broader social change. Two young women, armed with nothing more than needle and thread, determination and courage, had not only claimed their own freedom but had helped hundreds of others do the same. They had proven that resistance could take many forms, not just violent rebellion, but patient planning, careful preparation, and the quiet courage to take one step after another toward a distant goal. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that freedom was not a destination, but a journey, not a gift, but a responsibility, not an individual achievement, but a collective obligation. The threads they had woven into their freedom quilt had become part of a larger tapestry, the ongoing struggle for human dignity and equality that continues to this day. Every person who stands up against injustice, every individual who risks their comfort to help others, every act of courage in the face of oppression continues the work that Amara and Zara began in that small sewing room more than a century ago. Their story reminds us that ordinary people, armed with extraordinary determination, can change the world one stitch at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. The threads of freedom, once woven into the fabric of history, become eternal, eternal.